Hello and welcome to the inaugural session of the Marvell Online Speaker Series, where we will be hosting and posting a variety of lectures on poet and politician Andrew Marvell. Eventually we hope to include other aspects of early modern literary culture as well. I'm Dr. Emma Annette Wilson and I will be presenting our first lecture. Thank you so much for tuning in and I hope you enjoy. The Genealogy of Marvell's Logic in To His Coy Mistress by Dr. Emma Annette Wilson. Our text and the time do sympathise. The old year is spent with running, the new year's hourglass is already turned, and the scripture here tells us of a renovation. Our descant upon this plain song, if it keep not tune, yet will keep time, for everything is beautiful in his time, and a word upon his wheels is like apples of gold in pictures of silver, whereas a parable in the mouth of fools is like a thorn in the hand of a drunkard. Andrew Marvell Sr. was fond of things which sympathised, using them as the principal logical structure for all of his sermons, which survive to us in a manuscript currently housed at the Hull History Centre. In this instance, he is delivering a New Year's sermon based on a subsection of 2 Corinthians 5:17, Ta archea parelethen edu gegonen ta panta kaina. The old things have gone, behold, all things become new, paralleling his sermon's message of renewal with a biblical citation, and using that comparison as a means of performing his exegesis for his parishioners. Marvell Sr.'s discursive tactic of comparison is one of the stalwarts of the discipline used to furnish the structure for all forms of discourse in the early modern period, logic. In 1605, Puritan logician Amandus Paulanus describes logic as the ars ratione bene utende, the art of using reason well, in a definition which was echoed by both his contemporaries, including Bartholomeus Keckerman, and also logicians from later in the 17th century, perhaps most famously including John Milton, who stated that logic was the ars bene ratio senandi, the art of reasoning well, in the 1640s, in an homogeneous approach which is useful when considering the discursive operations of not only one Marvell, but more specifically 2. For both father and son were trained to formulate their writings in accordance with this central early modern art, and its consistency throughout the time span covering the careers of each man is critical in supporting my argument today for parallels between their writing styles. Yet more than simply learning what Christoph Schiebler representatively termed the ars artium or art of arts in similar fashions, I contend that by viewing their works through its lens today, we can see close connections in terms of each Marvell's application of its principles in pursuit of their arguments. Marvell Sr.'s New Year sermon proclaims the need for renovation and renewal, a message which can be constructively summarized as a carpe diem. In a separate sermon on Jerome 4:3 and So Not Among Thorns, as I've mentioned at the SCRC paper in 2012, Marvell Sr. makes a similar case that the spiritual seed time is always present, and that we must not look that God should carry us to heaven as a sack is carried to the market. This incredibly energetic preacher, chastised for injecting too much of his own words into his sermons, appears to have practiced what he preached, as he argues in favour of spending 3 hours in a day listening to sermons, on the basis that plays last longer and men hearing do not complain of tediousness. Yet it is my contention that in the discursive method of his sermons, proceeding as they do by layer upon layer of comparison, formed, as we shall see, in accordance with early modern logic, that the lesson which Marvell Sr. taught at least to Marvell Jr. in his preaching was not necessarily the principle of carpe diem for spiritual renewal per se, but rather the method of persuading others of the wisdom of carpe diem in rather less religious circumstances. We are all, of course, more than familiar with Marvell Jr.'s most famous iteration of carpe diem in To His Coy Mistress, and today I wish to align his approach with something rather less familiar. That is, I argue that the way in which Marvell Jr. achieves his carpe diem message is by using the same methods of early modern logic, and specifically its arguments of comparison via carefully chosen agreeing and disagreeing parallels, which he first learned from his father's sermonizing. To begin to understand this discursive genealogy, it is instructive first for us to turn to Marvell Sr.'s New Year's address once more to see precisely how he deploys a particular operation of logic, the argument by comparison. In keeping with Marvell Sr.'s theological inclinations, I will take my definitions from the logic textbook of the very Puritan Dudley Fenner, although it must be noted that these are entirely synchronous with those from the whole spectrum of logics, including Catholic texts. Fenner defined arguments of comparison as being either agreeable, or disagreeable. An agreeable argument is that which doeth agree with that to which in reason it is referred. In other words, it is an argument built out of similar parallels, which are at least represented as being equal to one another in their quantity and quality, to suggest a single unified conclusion. Contra, a disagreeable argument are those reasons which disagree being referred one unto another, either somewhat differing, or such as cannot stand together, commonly called opposites. As he opens his New Year's sermon, we see that Marvell Senior is comfortable in employing successfully both those arguments which do sympathise and those which countermand one another to make his case. Building on the agreeable premise of his text and time sympathising for his audience, he pictures the harmonies and aesthetic benefits of apples of gold which enhance a picture of silver as a neat parallel to a word in his wheels to illuminate Ecclesiastes 3:11, that everything is beautiful in his time. As his arguments neatly coo to one another amidst their mutually enhancing qualitative properties, Marvell's agreeable exemplar aimed to exhort his audience to make themselves, too, an agreeable argument in tune with this time of spiritual renewal and renovation. However, a key way in which he reinforces his pro-agreement argument is by setting forth multiple instances of disagreeable argument by way of none too gentle threats to shepherd his flock sternly away from the dire consequences of such disharmony between one's conduct and the present time, which, as he mentions, is always the Christian seed time. In stark contrast to the golden apples literally and figuratively gilding and improving a silver painting, Marvell Senior calls on an alternative chapter and verse from Proverbs, this time 25:11, to produce a comparison which, although agreeable within itself, is in clear disunion from his theme of spiritual renovation. For in describing something which is out of step with the spiritual requirements of its time, he makes the comparison from Proverbs that a parable in the mouth of fools is like a thorn in the hand of a drunkard. In so saying, Marvell Senior makes a complex logical yoking between the argument of agreement, linking a fool's use of a parable, with a drunkard's wild flailing with thorn in hand, as two things which are both undesirable and also inconsistent with time-appropriate behaviours. Yet, whilst these exemplar reinforce one another agreeably, this is most disagreeable in relation to the spiritual carpe diem motif set forth within his first comparison. This play of agreement and disagreement, with its complex interweavings, is a key way in which Marvell Senior skillfully uses the art of logic to create a compelling blend of inspiration to be the golden apples to a silver picture, set against the ominous background threat that should this not come to pass, the result will be as unhappy as the hazards incurred by an armed drunkard. It's a daring manoeuvre to make in many ways, for in calling on Proverbs 25:11 and discussing the damaging effects of mixing fools and parables, Marvell Senior inevitably exposes himself to the risk of being put into the very same category. Yet, equally, perhaps this is less of a risk and more of a challenge to his audience. For the success of his parables by comparison in his sermons essentially depends upon their ability to conform themselves to serve as an appropriate spiritual argument of agreement with the renovation which this time of year requires. It is this nexus of comparison built upon the principles of early modern logic which Marvell Senior relies upon to create his entire exegetical process in this and other sermons. There is a further particularly intriguing argument of comparison, which he uses in reference to precisely the kind of church performance which he himself is in the process of furnishing, as he states that, "Where God hath his church, the devil hath his chapel. Where there is a throng of auditors, and his agent is not tongue-tied." Marvell Senior conjures simultaneously arguments of agreement and disagreement here. For as he notes, both God and Satan are in possession of a place of sermonizing, i.e. they have the matter of their approach to their audience, in the precise form of a church and chapel respectively, with a logical end or outcome that at least Satan has a substantial audience of willing listeners. In phrasing his comparison this way, Marvell Senior intriguingly omits a key part of the logical sequence belonging to God in this sentence. For the building blocks of early modern logic were cause, matter, form, and end, and yet no explicit end or outcome is detailed for God in this configuration. I would suggest this might well again be a form of self-reference within Marvell Senior's work, as he puts himself and his own congregation in the place of gods. Yet whilst one should expect that to be an argument of disagreement with a devilish congregation, at least in matter and form, he reveals it to be decidedly agreeable. It is in the cause and desired logical end of such a comparison where he implies disagreement ought to take place. For inevitably, as God acts as the cause or driving force working upon his congregation, and the devil likewise works his own crowd, these are clearly spiritually disagreeable motivators. Both logically and theologically, their ends or outcomes ought to be correspondingly disagreeable. But Marvell Sr. does not explicitly state what the outcome of God's church sermonizing is, and I argue that this is because he has cast himself and his own congregation in Trinity Church in Hull as the matter and form of God's congregation as his comparison, and in so doing places both the onus and also the potential blame onto himself and his auditors as to whether they achieve the logically and theologically correct outcome of taking up the spiritual carpe diem impetus in following God's will in renovation this new year, or if they fail and conform instead to the old crafty merchant, Satan. This is a highly dexterous manipulation of arguments of agreement and disagreement, which speaks both to Marvell Sr.'s own capabilities in this art, and also the level of discursive intelligence which he expected within his congregation. It is my contention within this paper that at least within the ears of his own son he found such intelligence, and his influence upon it can clearly be seen in the logical arguments of agreement used by Marvell Jr. to create his own Carpe Diem argument decades later, in a setting perhaps more suited to the Devil's Chapel than Holy Trinity Church, Hull, as he works his agreeable reasons upon the coy mistress by the side of the humber. Let us now turn to this poem to consider parallels between the Carpe Diem tactics of Marvell Sr. and Jr. To His Coy Mistress is certainly a poem which a number of critics have found world and time enough to visit in a logical manner. Drawing on T.S. Eliot's early observation that the three strophes have something like a syllogistic relation to each other, critics such as B.J. Sokol, Richard Kreider, Clarence Miller, and recently Barry Targan have used this angle to suggest that the poem possesses a logical tendency. Their engagement with early modern conceptions of the syllogism, or indeed of logic more broadly, varies significantly. Miller instructively turns to Richard Crackenthorpe's 1622 Logicae Quinque Libri for a definition of a fallacy of consequent in a syllogism, comparing this to the work of Caspar Rodolph and Robert Sanderson. However, after this promising incursion to an early modern reading method, Miller abruptly announces that the imagery of the final syllogistic movement of the poem strikes deeper than rational explanation, and in a particularly frustrating near miss, early modern logic returns to being a merely vegetative love. Richard Kreider likewise exhibits an instructive impulse, consulting Antoine Arnaud's La Logique of 1662 to suggest the currency of logic as a discursive method for Marvell. However, when it comes to analysis, he uses a paraphrase. In a similar vein, in 1993, Geoffrey Carone used modern cohesion analysis to examine interclausal connectives in The Coy Mistress to argue for the importance of logical semantics in literary criticism. Also chased by Time's winged chariot, Sokol makes the promising statement invoking the definition of the traditional syllogism found in an authoritative and conservative logic textbook to analyze The Coy Mistress. However, the text he refers to is M.R. Cohen and E. Nagel's An Introduction to Logic and Scientific Method of 1972, not a staple of either Marvell's bookshelf. Especially in light of the manuscript evidence of Marvell Sr.'s active engagement with and dependence on early modern logic, I contend that these abstractions away from this fundamental art are inherently impoverishing. It is only by employing the analytical capabilities of early modern logic as used by Marvell Sr. and Jr. when creating their work that we can understand how these discursive methods have passed from one Marvell to another. Whilst critics have attributed the tripartite structure of To His Coy Mistress to the syllogism, instead, early modern logical analysis reveals it to be based on a much more basic fundamental element of this art: cause. Specifically, it functions by exploring the logical ends of internal and external, or proeumenic and prokatarctic causes, via an argument of disagreement similar to that used repeatedly by Marvell Sr. in his sermons. By way of confirmation, it is instructive to note that Christopher Airy's logic textbook, which was used at Oxford and Cambridge in the late 1620s and 30s, contains the following definition of arguments by comparison, which closely resembles similar statements made by Fenner, Polanus, and other logicians writing a quarter of a century or more earlier. Airy states that comparatives are the things through which one item is brought to be compared to another, either in agreement or disagreement. Airy continues that an agreeable comparative argument is the congruence of two terms in a third item common to them both. This is either in a particular manner with regard to one of their qualities and is called similitude, or in quantity and is called parity or equality. A disagreeable argument is the difference between two terms when considered via a third. It is either in terms of a particular one of their qualities and is called dissimilitude, or it is in terms of quantity and is called imparity or inequality. It is my contention that Tahir's coy mistress operates principally by engaging with an extended argument of disagreement, displaying a disparity between applications of internal and external causes. It is this interplay between internal and external cause, depicted in terms of a comparison of disagreement, that conquers coyness, not a syllogistic manoeuvre. This is apparent from the first stanza, depicting the actions available to wooed and wooer if their own internal desires were the sole logical causes at work. Driven by these proegumenic motivations, the lovers could pass their long love's day in service of coyness and praise by the side of the Ganges, or complaining by the arguably less romantic and definitely less satisfying Humber. Free from external causes, they would indeed be rewarded with a matter of luxurious time to court in the logical form of 100, 200, or 30,000 years to achieve the end of adoration. However, here Marvell Jr. takes a leaf from Senior's sermon book and provides an argument of comparison by disagreement in the second stanza. Not as off-putting as the thorn and drunkard motif, nonetheless, both lines of discourse are intended to act upon their listeners to inspire a contrary action to mitigate the unfortunate event depicted. For Marvell Jr. reminds his lover of the consequences of adhering to an internal impetus for a love vaster than empires and more slow, in a world stuck with the external procatarctic cause of time. Time's winged chariot acts logically as an external procatarctic cause, forcing the lovers away from a desired fluvial eternity and towards the far drier, colder reality of deserts of vast eternity encapsulated in the marble vault. It is the contrast between internal and external causes which fuels Marvell's poetic debate here, and allows it to function as an effective argument by conforming to very familiar logical forms known to Marvell himself from his father's sermon. This does not rely on the contrivance of a syllogism, but on varying the functions of the most fundamental building blocks of early modern logic, i.e. cause, and the different ends which it can produce. In this stanza, with time functioning as the driving external cause upon the matter of the beauty and echoing song of the two lovers, taking the logical form of dust and ashes, with an end of a distinct lack of embracing, as both beauty and song are lost alike in the confines of the marble vault. So how does Marvell Jr. resolve the dichotomy between the incompatible and equally unappealing logical ends produced by these disparate internal and external causes? I argue it is by encouraging his two lovers to take control of their own causality once more in the final stanza, just as Marvell Sr. advocates carpe diem to his congregation, so too Marvell Jr. calls on his lovers to cause and determine their own logical end, as he states that, though we cannot make our sons stand still, yet we will make him run. Playing further with arguments of agreement and disagreement, here Marvell Jr. provides us with a contrast between the impossibility of the lovers proegumenically being able to make the sun stand still and another logical end which is available to them. That is, by channeling a different set of internal causes, they can themselves act as an external cause upon the sun, and by extension upon time itself, to make him run. In so doing, Marvell Jr. is not just making a syllogistic conclusion, but he is manipulating the most key roles of logic to divert causal power away from time and into the hands of his lovers. Thus Marvell achieves an inversion of external causal power. For whereas in the second stanza time acts upon the lovers with the logical end that they cannot embrace, here they themselves take on the role of procatarctic cause working upon time. This emphasis on acting as a procatarctic cause on others extends to the opening premise of the poem, as the persona aims for his own logically constructed poem to work procatarctically to win over the proegumenic coyness of his mistress. It is by playing with these different balances of causal power that Marvell Jr. is able to construct a series of arguments of agreement and disagreement to build a persuasive carpe diem argument. Furthermore, on a larger level, this is a key way in which he transforms the logical components of his father's puritanical sermons into fundamental persuasive factors in amorous argument. In the urging of Marvell Jr.'s lovers to make time run, we can hear an echo of the method used by Marvell Sr. as he reminds his audience repeatedly that the Christian seed time is always present. In a further concatenation of parallels which serve as the climax to one of his New Year's sermons, he argues that sin is of a spreading nature. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, and it frets like a gangrene. That which is an egg will be a scorpion, and though it be a child, it will be ere long a giant. Pluck up, therefore, these thorns of impiety,